Pax et bonum. May God's peace and goodness shine upon you today. Folks, on today's show, I won't do any cultural or political reflection. Aww. I know, would love to comment on Trump bombing Iranian nuclear facilities, but I just have to finish this Crusades series. And may I qualify? I have lost many Patreon supporters over the years because I speak into history, culture, politics. The first time I lost supporters was in early 2020 when I spoke out against the C-19 vaccines. Lost still more paid supporters when I did an extensive series that year called The Cult of the Now. People didn't like that I spoke out against neo-Marxism. Did they embrace neo-Marxism, or did they just get uncomfortable hearing any kind of critique at all? I don't know. Later, I lost supporters for my doing the climate change series, and sheesh, the further we go, the more we know that was a sham tram, right? And I know my talking about Otto Pen Joe and even Orange Man Bad, both of that cost me supporters. Amen. Christians shouldn't talk about politics. So, man, if I just shut the glonk up about real life, maybe I wouldn't lose supporters, right? Huh? Well, then I'd be self-censoring. And truly, maybe it's because I was in the university system for 25 years where I saw groupthink firsthand, or maybe it's just my reaction to a culture that now heartily embraces self-censorship. The church warmly embraces assaultless self-censorship. But I would have never started my podcast if I was going to bail out when something true needed to be said with regard to a lying spirit. So, sincerely, thanks to all my faithful Patreon supporters. I couldn't and wouldn't do the podcast without you. My listener, do you have respect for someone who will speak out from out of a Christian worldview toward cultural matters? You get it that pastors have mostly played mute over the last 10 cultural crazy years? Please, I'm asking you, go to Patreon, Patreon, and sign up for a monthly unpledge. $10, $15, $20. It all goes to my weekly producing out-of-the-box biblical theological content for thinking Christians. If you make a $20 or more a month pledge, I'll send you one of my books. I send my supporters weekly transcripts of the shows. Go to Patreon, Patreon, and support me. I'd appreciate it. So you can help support a relevant Christian mission for such a time as this. Not everyone knows, but the people of Iran have lived under a theocratic, hardliner, traditional Quranic regime for some 46 years now. Those beautiful people were thrust back in time from 1979 to what, 679? The freedom they enjoyed under the Shah was upended. People began living in terror should they say anything against the new Ayatollah, the supreme leader. It's a kind of religious tyranny the likes of which America's founders were well aware. And they were indeed aware not only of the history of Muslims invading Europe, but of the horrors of life under Muslim rule in their own lifetimes. But folks, for all that recent Iranian misery, Lord, deliver the Iranians from that monstrous traditional Quranic regime. For all that recent Iranian misery, it pales compared to what Muslims did through the medieval era. And I'm going to touch on some of that today. It's called Dhimmitude. Fittingly, in this series, I've focused on the main Crusader versus Muslim battles. I mean, that's what the Crusades were about, right? Liberating the Middle East from the tyranny of the sultans. What I haven't much touched upon are the other side elements of life under Muslim rule. Today, I want, like I say, first to touch on some of that. And while I think our knowledge of that history is worthwhile on its own, I'm going to describe some of the horrors so that you can further understand why medieval European Christians would risk family, life, their futures, lives by going some 1,300 miles down south to Egypt. They were motivated, as we've seen repeatedly, to glorify Christ, to set Jerusalem free. But they were also keenly aware of the kind of horrors I will describe in today's show. We've seen that in medieval warfare, European or Muslim, that when a city was sieged, it would be offered terms of surrender by the assaulting army. If those terms were rejected and then the city fell, the entire population of the city could be, or frequently would be, slaughtered. And the thinking was, they didn't surrender. They, air quotes, forced the sieging army to do battle. So the city was then fair game for plunder and even massacre. Now I think that's ghastly and immoral, but that's how medieval warfare worked. What didn't work, in Europe anyway, is that the losers would then, if they weren't slaughtered, be carted off into generational slavery. Muslims did do that for centuries on end. Bat Yor, Y-E'-O-R, Bat Yor, in her mind-blowing, it's a heart-blowing book on Dhimmitude. Class, please say Dhimmitude. Dhimmitude, teacher. Dhimmitude, subservience under Muslim rule. Bat Yor said, quote, during the centuries of Muslim expansion, a continuous flow of non-Muslim peoples supplied the slave markets. As late as 1658, Polish, Muscovite, Circassians were all bought and sold like animals on the market, close quote. Slavery hasn't even ended in many Muslim countries today, though we never hear about it. Here are the Muslim countries where slavery is still active. Pakistan, Indonesia, Turkey, Bangladesh, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Afghanistan, Egypt, and Eritrea. Eritrea's half Christian. All that, even though some Muslim hadiths, a hadith is an oral tradition, you guys, an oral tradition about Muhammad, but which is not in the Koran. Kind of like the Catholic Church has oral traditions about Jesus, what the apostles said about Jesus. Some Muslim hadiths deign to call slaves brothers. One Muslim webpage I read dared to say it like this, quote, the social and civil rights that Islam has accorded to the slaves are almost equal to the free individuals, close quote. Slaves are, the Muslim webpage says, even allowed to give refuge to enemies during war. It says, quote, if the slave gives refuge to an enemy, it would be respected in the same way as given by a free individual. And I'm thinking, the Ayatollah's police today are not granting such freedom to Iranians when they consider giving refuge to Israeli Mossad spies. So that webpage is just all cray-cray. It's spin. It's propaganda. It's spin. Yes, dear slave, you're a brother all right, as long as you submit to your owner master's whims, sexual and otherwise, then you're a dear bro. But we know that even that doesn't square with reality, because only a Muslim is part of the Ummah, the Muslim community, right? Traditionally speaking, only a Muslim. And while the Ummah deserve dignity, respect, and decency, the Dhimmis, the subjugated, the humiliated, those outside the Ummah, do not. But you guys, the contemporary spin is great and prevalent. Even the BBC, British Broadcasting News, spins so hard that it reads like a whirling dervish. Listen to this. Here's a quote from their page. Quote, "It's misleading to use phrases such as Islamic slavery and Muslim slave trade, even though slavery existed in many Muslim cultures at various times, since the Atlantic slave trade is not called the Christian slave trade, even though most of those responsible were Christians." End quote. What? Sheesh? Sorry, BBC. Christianity gets not one free pass for its slave trading or colonialism, so the BBC is spinning itself hard right out of the truth. Here's more from the BBC. Islam's approach to slavery added the idea that freedom was the natural state of affairs for human beings. So Islam treated slaves as human beings as well as property. Islam banned the mistreatment of slaves. Islam barred Muslims from enslaving other Muslims. End quote. But actually, if you study unfiltered history, none of that's true. So why does the BBC spin so hard? Well, that's another question entirely. I mean, oil? The need to purchase oil is certainly at issue, and so is the long-standing British colonialism, so there's a good amount of guilt at work. But generally speaking, the frenetic, present-day British government embrace of Islam we are now witnessing, the number of mayors across the UK is just astounding how many of them are Muslims, and I'm wondering, will the UK survive as the British Empire even one more generation? Whew, I don't know. That British embrace of Islam owes to the same self-loathing, same post-Christian, post-truth cultural meltdown we vividly see at work here in America. It is a self-consuming dynamic, and it's wild to watch. The Brits used to control huge swaths of the Middle East, or control as much as could be controlled. I mean, the Middle East has always been a powder keg since Cain slew Abel. Again, folks, different Muslim ethnicities enslaved and took turns massacring different tribes across most of the 1500 years of Islam's existence. The ancient tribalism probably runs deeper than the Sunni-Shia Islamic divide. Anyway, what I'm going to share with you today will make evident that those propagandistic spinny spins are all entirely fallacious. What was it like to live under Islam if you weren't a Muslim? Well, one thing had to do with forced conversions. Interestingly, the Koran forbids forced conversions. However, writes again the Egyptian Jewish Arabic-speaking Bat Yor, quote, "The wars and requirements of Islamic domination over the conquered lands and populations relegated this principle of religious tolerance to the realm of theory. At no point in history was religious tolerance respected. The jihad, or its alternative, payment of tribute and submission to Islamic law or getting massacred and enslaved, the jihad or its alternative is a contravention of the principle of religious freedom. The constant aggression by Muslim armies against the Dar al-Harb, the territory of war because those folks have not yet submitted to Islam, to Muslim rule. The constant aggression by Muslim armies against the Dar al-Harb, the razzias, the raids on non-Muslim populations condemned to slavery for their religion, the piracy on the seas in order to ransom travelers, the regional deportations of the conquered, the destructions of towns and villages, all these recurrent acts of aggression in a compulsory jihad, repeated over the centuries, constituted permanent violations of religious freedom," close quote. And it involved Armenians, Syrians, Spaniards, Slavic peoples. They all endured defeat, enslavement, forced conversion by the hundreds of thousands. Across the centuries, as I've said in earlier shows, entire ethnic groups who had followed Christ were raided, massacred, captured, tortured, taxed into non-existence in the Middle East. Well, all of that happened unless they assented to forced conversion. Much of the Middle East for centuries on end was Christianized. No longer today, not today. Why is that? Islam. So there was forced conversions, and then there was just general humiliation. The nature of Muslim to Dhimmi relationships is by definition one of power. Muslims, by the will of Allah, are to wield final power. That means the subjugated must be humiliated, and it's for their own good. Christians and Jews were further hated, and so deserving of humiliation, because they had, air quotes, manipulated the Bible with deletions and distortions. Distortions like what? Well, like Jesus was not really crucified. That's untenable in Muslim thinking. Jesus wasn't crucified. The Christians distorted and added that. But the truth is that this humiliation took on many forms. The list is likely as long as our imaginations could run with it, but here are some noted historic examples. Dhimmi houses, the subjugated homes, could not be bigger or more splendid than Muslim houses. Dhimmis could not either have Muslim servants, how's that for you, brother? Dhimmis couldn't have servants or own arms. Dhimmi men could not marry Muslim women. To do so was punishable by death. And yes, Muslim men could marry Christian or Jewish women. The Dhimmi were forced to clean latrines and carry away dead animals. Dhimmis could not ride a camel or a horse. They could sometimes ride a donkey outside the city limits, but when a Muslim passed by, they had to dismount and show respect. Jews often got it worse than Christians. Muslim children in some cities were allowed to throw stones at Jews. Jews still get it bad in Iran. I was reading online about what's going on with Jews in Iran. It's not a happy, comfortable situation. Dhimmis were often commanded to walk to the left, the unclean, the impure side of Muslims. You wipe with your left hand in the Middle East, and so Dhimmi would have to walk to the left. It was not uncommon that the height of Dhimmi doorways was shortened in order to force the Dhimmi to stoop to enter. It was a means of humiliation. Dhimmis were not allowed to enter certain quarters of Muslim cities. Non-Muslims were deemed unclean. Dhimmis could not own land in Muslim territories, and then, Christians and Jews could never build churches or synagogues. And that is a mucho abbreviated list of humiliations. And much of those continued into the 19th and 20th centuries in the Middle East. So Dhimmitude, forced shame and humiliation, was part of the absolute fabric of Muslim culture. Then there was the practice of devshirme. And you guys, this atrocity was officially given an institutional name in the 14th century under the Ottoman Turkish Empire, but it was a practice that dated back for centuries. Devshirme. Class, please say devshirme. Devshirme, teacher. Devshirme involved capturing and enslaving 1/5 of the Christian children as tribute. It was a kind of people taxation, a human taxation. Those same children given as tribute would then be forcibly converted to Islam. And believe it or not, even the children of Christian nobility were taken in devshirme. Kids were taken from Greeks, Serbians, Bulgarians, Armenians, Albanian Christian homes, again involving the aristocracy, even from Eastern Orthodox priests. In the East, priests can marry and have children. And Bat-Yor writes, quote, "At a fixed date, every father at pain of death had to gather with his sons at the central place of the village. The Muslim recruiting agents then selected the handsomest and most robust for slavery and conversion. No father could avoid this blood tribute on pain of severe punishment. Close quote. This happened primarily with sons aged 14 to 20, but it could happen to a kid as young as 8 years old. And then it was not uncommon that the same kids would be sold back to their parents. Here's how Raymond Ibrahim describes what happened under the later than, just to be honest, this is later than the Crusader era in the Ottoman Empire. He writes, quote, "Sometimes Ottoman officials would go door to door. Other times fathers were ordered to bring their sons to the public squares. After the boys were examined, the very best, handsomest, halest were hauled off, often torn from the grips of their hysterical mothers. Any father who dared offer resistance was executed on the spot." A 16th century European manuscript recounts the sorrow the Greeks bear, their fathers and mothers who are separated from their children at the prime of their life. Think of the heartrending sorrow. How many mothers scratch out their cheeks? How many fathers beat their breasts with stones? What grief these Christians experience on account of their children. How many mothers say, "It would have been better to see them dead and buried in our church rather than to take them alive in order to become Turks and abjure our faith. Oh, better that you had died." Close quote. I was in Greece a couple times and heard local Greeks speak of their ongoing hatred for Muslims, for what they did to the Greeks over the centuries. It's just horrific and terrible and awful to recount. But the practice of devshirme was like the herding of sheep. Sheep, boys, young men, taken, circumcised, forcibly converted to become Muslims. How'd they do that? How'd they force a change of heart? Through affliction, pain. For example, Ottomans would make the boys drudge pointless toil day and night, and they would give them no bed to sleep on and very little food. The boys were allowed to speak to one another only when it was urgently necessary, and were made to pray together without fail at 4 prescribed times every day. As for any little offense, the Muslims beat them cruelly with sticks, rarely hitting them less than 100 times, and often as much as 1,000. After punishments, the boys have to come to them and kiss their clothing and thank them for the beatings they received. That's all from Raymond Ibrahim again. So the moral degradation and humiliation of all this was part of the training system. And then to rend hearts deeper still, too often these boys were used for homosexual purposes. Pederasty, it's called. Class, please say pederasty. Pederasty, teacher, sex between an older man and an adolescent boy. And often, these pederastic arrangements were to inflict still further humiliation on the boys, their families, and the enemies of the Muslims. And even better, the practice of devshirme served to keep the subjugated enemies weak. And all that history is heart-stabbing, right? But my listener, even that gets a massive historic revision, a whitewashing. Raymond Ibrahim writes, quote, "Ironically, this abduction, forced conversion, and jihadi indoctrination of Christian children is portrayed by several leading academics as the equivalent of sending a child away for a prestigious education and training for a lucrative career." Close quote. And my hunch, you guys, my listener, is that just me repeating all of this propaganda seems harsh to many. On my part, it can't be true because we just never hear of these kinds of things. But that is precisely how deep all of the whitewashing of Islam's history goes, and it is, to me, astonishing. Anyway, this training, this reprogramming, forced conversion of Christians to Islam, it had a still greater long-term goal. And that takes us to yet another vocabulary word fitting for an understanding of historic Islam: janissaries. The making of a janissary, or in Arabic it's yanissary, turning someone into a new soldier. Class, please say janissary. Janissary, teacher. The making of janissaries involved taking these abducted Christian, usually Christian boys, young men, and turning them into highly trained, loyal to the Sultan, loyal like a son who loves his dear father, loyal to Allah, fierce and ferocious soldiers, Muslim soldiers. And significant to their reprogramming was teaching them to hate Christianity, hate Christ, to hate the West. Janissaries would be taken into battles, jihad, or raids, gara, and then set loose on their former Christian kin, all to perpetuate the cycle of conquest, enslavement, and conversion, always to Christendom's demographic loss and Islam's demographic gain. So this was about demographic transformation, yeah. During the Ottoman Empire, and again, just to be clear, this was after the time of the Crusades, but before the Muslim capture of Constantinople, which I'll describe in a bit. During the Ottoman Empire, 300,000 Hungarians were enslaved and carried off in just a few days' time in the year 1438. Did you know this? The word Slav equals slave. Slav comes from the massive enslavement of Slavic populations during the Ottoman Empire. And following these massive human depopulations, an Italian journalist living in Constantinople at the time wrote this, quote, "Young and old everywhere were seen led away in iron fetters tied to the backs of horses. And women and children were herded by dogs without any mercy or piety. The slave markets in Adrianople, the farthest edge of western Turkey, it's about 12 miles from Bulgaria. The slave markets were so inundated with human flesh that children sold for pennies. A very beautiful slave woman was exchanged for a pair of boots, and 4 Serbian slaves were traded for a horse." Close quote. The enslavement, the trafficking was immense. And all of that plunder, all of that success, all of that Allah-blessed victory in jihad helped to encourage the Ottomans to finally assault the giant thorn in the side of Islam, Constantinople. And I want to talk with you and think with you now about the final conquest of Constantinople. Founded in BC 657, the city of Byzantium, then, to be renamed Constantinople in 330 AD after Emperor Constantine, hence the city of Constantine, Constantinople. Constantinople stood against sieges for 2,110 years. My listener, me, I think that's jaw-dropping. It's been 2,000 years since Jesus lived. Constantinople successfully fended off siege attempts after siege attempts for 2 millennia. Islamic history holds that a Muslim prophecy from Syria in the year 691, some 59 years after Muhammad himself died, that prophecy predicted the prophet's final conquest of the giant thorn. So, in 1451, Murad II, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, died, and he was succeeded by his 19-year-old son, Mohammed II. Mohammed II reigned from 1451 to 1481. Like a lion who enters a new pride and kills all the cubs, Muhammad's first order was to have his 19 brothers and 3 concubines pregnant by his brothers all decapitated. He wanted no familial threat. Then he prophesied that he finally would be the one to fulfill Islamic prophecy and conquer Constantinople. But first, he, again as the new Sultan of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, he swore to the Emperor of Constantinople, Constantine the 11th, that he was his friend for life. As we saw earlier in this series, deceit in warfare was allowable by Muslim tradition, or we could call it deceit toward the Dar al-Harb, right? The territory, the people of war, the Dar al-Harb. That was allowable to be deceitful to them according to Muslim tradition. So, in truth, peace was on Muhammad's lips while war was in his heart. Just a few months after he was crowned new sultan, Muhammad took a team of 1,000 masons to the European side of the Bosphorus, across the harbor from the great city. They wanted to spy, they wanted to assess the situation. And when the Christian Emperor Constantine the 11th sent messengers to remind Muhammad of their recently signed peace treaties, Muhammad had those messengers beheaded. If that wasn't a clear enough sign of the Sultan's intentions, when a Venetian ship bringing corn to Constantinople came through the harbor, Muhammad sunk the ship, beheaded the half-drowned crew, and then, as became his custom, Muhammad impaled the captain. And here's how those gruesome executions took place. Quote, "The Grand Turk would make the prisoner lie down on the ground, whereupon a sharp long pole was placed at the entrance to the rectum. Then with a big mallet held in both hands, the executioner struck with all his might, so that the pole entered the human body, and according to its path, the unfortunate person lingered on or died at once. Then the executioner raised the pole and planted it in the ground. Not surprisingly, the impaled man did not live long." Emperor Constantine the 11th knew then for certain that Muhammad's intent was siege. As we might expect, Emperor Constantine appealed to the Roman Catholic Pope for aid for soldiers, and yes, said Pope Nicholas V, we will help. But alas, no Western Christian king or noble came to the rescue of Constantine the 11th. They all claimed to be busy with their own affairs. And probably centuries on end of mutual suspicion and betrayal between Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox finally caught up to Constantinople's emperor. One brilliant man who did go to Constantinople was Giovanni Giustiniani from Genoa, Italy. He was a siege expert, and he brought with him 700 highly trained soldiers. The emperor, Constantine the 11th, made the supremely qualified Giovanni into the army general. In total, Constantinople had less than 7,000 fighters. 7,000 men to protect some cumulative 15 linear miles of walls. The tens of thousands of city women, servants, elderly, children were there to help as best they could. But 7,000 against Muhammad's 100,000 fighters? The city looked doomed. Yes, the city did have a giant chain that, when pulled taut, protected against any invasion from the harbor, but things looked grim. Both sides, Christians and Muslims, prayed to their gods. This time around, though, Muhammad had a new weapon, and he counted on it to bring him success. Cannons. Built by a paid Hungarian mercenary named Urban, Muhammad even had one monstrous cannon. It was 27 feet long. It could fire 1,300-pound balls across a mile. On April 6, 1453, Muhammad ordered the siege, and it was a horrible siege indeed. In a way that would anticipate later Russian approaches to warfare, the Sultan would send squadron after squadron of men against the walls, ladders run up to the base of the wall, grappling hooks thrown up over the top, fire used against the Christians. But consistently they would be repelled by Giovanni, with piles upon piles of dead Muslim bodies strewn beneath the city walls, littered about like cordwood from musket shots and skilled crossbowmen, wasted human capital, fodder. Muhammad grew enraged. His treasured cannons often misfired, often collapsed during recoil, and fell apart such that it would take weeks to repair them. For their part, the Christians would, under cover of darkness, go and repair the breaches in the walls, and they were so skilled that oftentimes the repair jobs were superior to the original wall itself, and Muhammad grew more enraged. When the Muslims could not get their ships over the taut harbor chain, Muhammad personally scourged his duke, the admiral, with a whip. For every Christian soldier that died, 4 Muslim soldiers died. Once more the Sultan became depressed and kicked the ground in desperation, biting his own hands like a dog. And so Muhammad turned to more extreme measures. He ordered hundreds of men and thousands of oxen. My listener, it's just amazing to me that Muhammad had thousands of oxen ready at his disposal. He ordered them to physically haul his Ottoman ships out of the Bosporus Sea, up over a hill, and then back down the opposite slope, all to bypass the giant protective harbor chain. And this move proved brilliant. The Muslims were able to blockade all incoming aid. In fact, one day the Muslims' naval fleet fought with the Christian ships. The Muslims had the superior numbers, and when 40 half-drowned Christian sailors managed to swim to shore, the Sultan had them seized, impaled through their anuses, right up through the top of their heads. Their impaled bodies were then placed outside the city walls as a sign. How'd Constantine XI respond to that? By executing 260 Ottoman prisoners atop the city walls. But Muhammad, he could care less. Next, Muhammad ordered his prized tower, and it was nicknamed the City Taker. He ordered that up to the walls because the tower was taller than the wall. And Muslims were able to shoot fire at the Christians, but the gallant Giovanni blew up the tower by rolling powder kegs into the moat below. 7 weeks of constant battle passed, to no avail. The city walls stood strong. Inside the city, however, with that naval blockade outside, food shortages set in. Soldiers of varied ethnicities began to fight with one another. For his part, Emperor Constantine begged them to be at peace. He even told them, "I am resolved to die here with you." Then he turned his head aside and wept with the church patriarch and the others who were there. At his own wits' end, the Sultan would nevertheless give up. After summoning all his senior officers, Muhammad told them he was going to send the entirety of his army at the city, all at once. They would overwhelm the Byzantines. And to fire up his army, Muhammad told them not only that if they died would they go to heaven and enjoy company with the Prophet himself, and also be received by beautiful black-eyed houris, concubines, right? But he also promised that they could sack everything they could get their eyes on. Men, women, beautiful sexified Christian women, as we've seen in earlier shows. The Muslims knew all Christian women were just sex hungry. They could have everything they could get their eyes on: men, women, property, treasures. Still more, Muhammad promised his men that if they failed to fight, they would themselves be impaled. And so, greatly motivated by both positive enticement and fear of horrific death, the army received Muhammad's fiery sermon with great joy. Religious shouts from the Muslim army could be heard inside the many layers of Constantinople's walls. And within the city, Emperor Constantine and his officers prayed, "Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy." And they received the Eucharist together inside the grand cathedral, Hagia Sophia. On May 29th at 2 in the morning, Muhammad unleashed military hell on the city. Cannon fire was accompanied by the shouts of 10,000s of Muslim soldiers. Ottoman trumpets were blown, cymbals were clashed, wave after wave of frenetic Muslim soldiers hit the walls. But 2 hours later, thousands of Muslims lay dead at the feet of the walls. About the same time, the Sultan's cannons opened up holes in the walls. And then something still more dreadful happened. The brilliant Christian hero General Giovanni was shot in the chest. Emperor Constantine pleaded with Giovanni not to abandon the battle, but it was too late. Giovanni boarded a waiting Genoese ship and died. At long last, fulfilling Muhammad's crazed desires, through a minor and unguarded doorway, thousands of Muslim jihadis rushed in. The outnumbered Christian defenders were crushed. Emperor Constantine removed his royal garments, mounted a horse, took up a sword, and rushed into the battle. After knocking many impious Muslims from the top of the walls, Emperor Constantine died at the city gate. The great 800-year-old thorn in the side of Islam was plucked. A city that had been founded by Constantine the Great finally fell with an emperor named Constantine the 11th. Then what? Oh, the expected mayhem, the murder of men, women, elderly, children, the sodomizing of men and boys, the rape of Christian women. Nuns were doubly targeted for debasement, so fierce was the Muslim hatred for Christianity. And those nuns not murdered were taken and sold into slavery. For her part, the beautiful daughter of Lucas Notaras, the Grand Duke, the admiral of the Byzantine Navy, she was raped. The Muslims took her to Hagia Sophia, the cathedral, placed her on the altar with a crucifix under her head, and gang-raped her. And the defilement was great. The eyes of dead saints' bodies were gouged out. Dead saints' bodies were dumped into the streets for dogs to eat. Church altars were turned into horse troughs. Priestly garments were used as saddles. The main crucifix of Hagia Sophia was processed through the Muslim camp, drums beating before it, a Turkish cap placed on Christ's head, spitting, shouts of, "Behold the Christian God." Bibles were stripped of their gold decorations, then burned. Icons were taken out and thrown into the fires. When Muhammad finally rode into the city, he ordered many of the people to be hacked to pieces in front of him for entertainment. That night at the victory drinking party, Muhammad adjured the Grand Duke to surrender his youngest son to the Sultan's sexual gratification. Hearing that, the Duke's face went ashen. When the Grand Duke told Muhammad no, he would not give him his son, the enraged Sultan ordered the Duke's execution. Then, as icing on the cake, Sultan Muhammad called for the head of Emperor Constantine to be brought to him, and as it turns out, they brought him somebody's noggin. No one knows if it was really Constantine, whereupon Muhammad took the head and nailed it to a column. The poor, living, conquered citizens of the city, some 45,000 of them, they were hauled off in chains to be sold into Eastern slavery. Oh, and just so you know, because we should add, because historian Raymond Ibrahim did add this in a footnote, quote, "Incidentally, it should not be imagined that the atrocities committed during the Islamic sack of Constantinople were significantly worse than those of earlier Islamic conquests. It's just that here in the 15th century, the first-hand records are both more detailed and better preserved." Close quote. At last, Muhammad told his officers, the ancient prophecy was fulfilled. Constantinople now belonged to the glory of Allah's jihad. And my listener, now, For 572 years, the city, renamed Istanbul, which means into the city, Istanbul has indeed existed under Muslim reign. Still, for all that horror, it might be a hidden blessing that Constantinople fell in the 15th century and not earlier. One historian put it like this: had the Muslims captured Constantinople in the 7th century rather than the 15th, all of Europe and America might be Muslim today. End quote. And I say, wow, yeah, I guess it's a hidden blessing indeed. You guys, hearing this narrative, this history, we ought to count our blessings. We should thank God for the civil peace that we daily enjoy. Because someday I'm going to ask the Lord, oh, Abba, what percentage of human beings suffered war, siege, slavery, sex enslavement, mutilation? Oh, have mercy. So thank you, God, and thank the Lord for family and health and peace. We praise you for all of that, Lord. Amen, amen. My listener, I'm honored and glad that you joined me. Please, everyone, until next week, go and turn on your beautiful God-given brains.